Thank you so much, Emily, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I know I'm competing with a game. Abe and Eliza Lyon were lined up on the starting blocks of freedom when slavery was abolished, having dreamed of this moment for most of their remembered lives. They sprinted to fulfill their visions of family, self-determination, and prosperity. By 1870, the Alabama couple had accomplished a great deal. Abe was 30 years old, Eliza was 35. They got legally married and set up a home in Choctaw County. Abe was working as a blacksmith from his own shop. Eliza left her job in domestic service and was keeping her own house, only occasionally working on the plantation just to raise a little bit of extra money. They amassed a horde of hogs, a significant investment that indicates they were producing cured meats and breeding specifically for the market. Their 3 children, William, Ella, and Annie, were enrolled in a local school. An older daughter was attending school in Demopolis, where Eliza grew up. Through their combined industry, Abe and Eliza had saved $600, the relative worth of which is more than $200,000 today. And they planned to move to Demopolis, buy property, and build a home of their own. Secession and the founding of the Confederacy were less than a decade in the past. Barely 5 years separated them from the end of the bloody Civil War and their sprint into freedom. They were living their best post-emancipation life. And I think that's important to acknowledge because their testimonies and other records make clear they were making the most of freedom. And those achievements provide context for why Confederates targeted them in what I call the war after the Civil War, the one white Southerners waged on African Americans' freedom. When I was in school, we weren't taught about Reconstruction, or if we were taught it, we were taught that it failed. What no one said outright, at least not in polite company, was that Black people were freed from slavery, given every opportunity to succeed, the right and the vote, and they failed to make the most of it. Again, that's not what people say, but that's what the failure narrative of Reconstruction meant. Now, that never made sense to me, but this is what I learned in school. So like many, I moved on to research other, more worthy topics. But something kept drawing me to Reconstruction. And the more I trained as a professional historian, and the more I researched the records of the era, the more I recognized what a truly transformative moment this was. There were so many revolutionary developments: abolition, the opening of schools, hundreds of independent Black churches, a boom in Black land ownership and entrepreneurship, national citizenship rights and protections, voting rights for Black men, and Black office holding, that the historian Eric Foner has called it the second founding, after the American Revolution. Abe and Eliza were part of this transformative moment that some historians have called the Second American Revolution. They had joined more than 4 million other Black people who snatched freedom from Confederates and who tried to live upright and build a morally just world for their families after the Civil War. By 1870, these Black Southerners had picked themselves up from slavery. They had reassembled their families to the best of their ability. They worked harder for themselves than they did for the people who held them in bondage. They established their communities with churches, schools, and orphanages. Some acquired land and opened their own businesses like Abe, but others were working, being industrious and saving money, with their eyes fixed on the prize of their own homesteads. And to protect all these rights and to secure their families' futures, Black men wanted to vote and to serve in office. Confederates saw these strides African Americans had made as a threat to their ongoing mastery and fought to sustain their privileges in the American system. They launched a torrent of attacks on Black people who were reaping the rewards of Reconstruction's expansion of freedom and democracy. In the spring of 1866, white men in Pulaski, Tennessee, formed social clubs in which they sometimes donned masks and elaborate costumes and performed musical entertainment. The white men called themselves the Ku Klux, after the Greek word circle, Klansmen's activities quickly spread across the South and evolved to roaming armed through communities in the middle of the night, conducting paramilitary attacks on Black and white progressive families. Extremists and their apologists often refer to these raids euphemistically as visits, masking their brutality behind the veneer of a friendly social call. Klansmen's work soon gave rise to an extremist movement that became so widespread that any white man or group of white men who wanted to intimidate or kill their targets might be associated with it, whether they were affiliated with a Klan or not. And as more white Southern men mustered into this growing shadow army's ranks and experimented with their acts of terror, they grew more deadly. This Klan violence is what I call the white war on freedom. Now, it may seem odd to liken what we've been taught was the peace to war, but wars never end as neatly as we think they do. They're often followed by new conflicts. And after the Civil War, the new conflict was white Southern conservatives' fight to undercut Black people's freedom and the establishment of a more egalitarian democracy. And so, there was no peace, as one historian put it, especially not for Black people in the South. And African Americans like Abe and Eliza Lyon knew it. White extremists targeted Black people with regularity and with shocking impunity. They shot down Black male voters at the polls. They stalked Black office holders and offered them bribes to leave office, and assassinated them or tried to assassinate them when that didn't work. They kidnapped Black men and women at gunpoint and disappeared them, disposing of their bodies in waterways and woods or just along the roads. They ambushed African American families with nighttime raids, which are like domestic home invasions today. And during these visits, white men holding Black families hostage subjected them to humiliation, torture, and murder. And during this period, there were countless massacres and mass killing events. African Americans resisted this violence, to be sure, in ways that made sense to them in the moment. Some hid or fled. Others bore arms, defended their homes, injuring or killing their attackers. But white extremist violence was so widespread that Black Southerners often found themselves outmanned and outgunned. Thousands of Black men, women, and children were killed or injured. And that's why the failure narrative of Reconstruction is so problematic. Reconstruction didn't fail. White Southerners violently overthrew it, and white Northerners and Westerners essentially let them. I Saw Death Coming tells that story. It follows Black Southern families on their journeys out of slavery through their experiences of the war white Southerners waged on their freedom, to their testimonies before Congress and beyond. It shows how Black people understood and articulated the human costs of Reconstruction's overthrow and abandonment, and it does that through the stories of families like Abe and Eliza's. On June 6, 1871, Abe spent the day in his blacksmithing shop, and Eliza finished her homemaking tasks. The children had completed their chores and lessons with time for play after. They were all in bed at their home at 11 p.m. when someone knocked on the door and asked if Abe was home. The family never heard any threats and were not thinking about such a thing, Eliza later said. That's why Abe answered that he was home, and he got up from the bed to open the door. But something, perhaps the sound of the visitors and his awareness of the threat they posed, or just a feeling, his skin tightening and puckering with goosebumps, so terrified Abe that he did not move. Human bodies and minds are wired to sustain themselves, and when under attack, focus solely on surviving and avoiding injury. When the mind detects threats to life, like Abe experienced, it triggers these pre-programmed escape plans by secreting stress chemicals to propel the body into action, specifically to survive by running, fighting, or hiding. But for some people, especially those who've experienced a prior trauma, the unthinkable happens. Their brain's defense circuitry shuts down, and they freeze. That's what we believe happened to Abe. He might have felt heavy, as though he were in a nightmare from which he would soon awaken. But this wasn't a dream, and that horrified him. Eliza, who remained calm, said Abe looked like he was in a perfect scare, suggesting he was completely paralyzed by fear. And Abe remained in that trance-like state, prompting Eliza to act, hoping to guide her husband to safety and to protect herself and their children. Eliza grabbed Abe, trying to steer him out the back door of their home. He was so scared, Eliza recalled. He wheeled around the room in that scare, not knowing what to do. Eliza's hope that her husband would regain control of his senses was soon dashed. The invaders burst through the door and threw a rope over his head and dragged him outside and away from their home. Eliza yelled to her neighbors or any passersby for help, but no one came. To silence Eliza's screams, the attackers drew their guns on her. They told me if I didn't hush hollering, they would blow a hole right through me, she said. Eliza knocked away one of the guns with her hand. The men held fire, but Eliza said they told her they would finish with me directly. The night riders carried Abe away from his home and up a hill nearby. Eliza didn't follow. But soon she saw the flash and heard the blast of a double-barrel shotgun. Then one of the men shouted an order for the rest of the gang to fire, and they did. After the terrorists killed Abe, Eliza spotted about 75 men returning to her house. I knew they were going to kill me, she said. Eliza ran inside to gather her children to flee, but her son William had disappeared, probably to go get help. Moving with her 2 daughters by her side, Eliza snuck out back to a field neighboring their home. They stopped at a thicket of woods to monitor the men's activities and take stock. Eliza could go no farther without knowing William's whereabouts, but staying put rendered her girls and her vulnerable to discovery. Eliza and the girls watched from the woods as the white men made up a light and began ransacking and searching their home. They tore up everything, she said. Wearing only their night clothes, Eliza and the girls moved farther into the woods as the night riders shot up her home. It sounded like there was over 100 shots at once, Eliza said. She and the girls remained hidden until sunrise, when she could see that the men had left. That's when she went to confirm Abe's killing and then find William. Eliza and the children lost Abe, their cash, all their possessions, that year's crop, their hogs, and most of Abe's tools. Their home had been destroyed, and the men's knowledge that they left an adult witness meant that it probably wasn't safe for the family to continue living on the homestead. Eliza reported what happened to local authorities, and a grand jury was convened to investigate the spate of attacks and spree killings in the area. But many of the witnesses were too afraid to talk. Initially, Eliza wasn't afraid. It's not clear who or what spooked her, but suddenly, she and the children shot out of Choctaw County. En route, she learned that Abe's killers were pursuing them, but she and the children managed to pick up the pace, and they safely made it to Demopolis, where she thought they might be safe. Receiving a flood of reports of attacks like the one on Abe and Eliza's family, the U.S. Congress convened an investigation into the execution of laws and the safety of the lives and the property of the citizens of the United States. The committee's work became known as the Klan hearings because of how prominently violence, like the visits, featured in the investigation. Lawmakers traveled to hotspots of Southern disorder, where they solicited testimonies from office holders, voters, accused perpetrators, and their victims. Families like Eliza's and Abe's had greeted emancipation with great expectations. Many of them achieved their dreams of freedom or were on their way to doing so when the white men came for them. When Congress issued the call for witnesses, they stepped forward, hoping to convince federal officials to take action to end the violence so their families could live in peace and pursue their dreams and secure their children's futures. Eliza, now a widow, lost everything. Displaced from her home community and support network, she was struggling to take care of herself and her children, which is exactly what the white men waging war on Black people's freedom intended, to destroy everything Black people built and leave them with nothing. Facing the prospect that the world wouldn't know what white Southerners did to them, that there might not be some form of redress, that free Black futures might be forestalled, survivors like Eliza stepped forward at great risk to themselves and their families and reported what happened to local authorities. And if that didn't pan out, they reported it to the Freedmen's Bureau and the U.S. Army. They shared their stories with governors and other office holders, with the press, and even members of Congress and the President of the United States. And as they told their stories, they revealed how much they gained with freedom and what they were losing to white violence. Brave survivors made their way to the hearing sites by foot, train, boat, and wagon, carrying stories of violent attacks as extremists made clear their determination to sustain as much of slavery as possible. They had released Black people from bondage, but we see from who, when, and why they attacked that they didn't believe that Black people had the right to their children, to choose their sexual partners, to education, to free religious lives, to labor autonomy, to land and capital, and to political power to protect all these rights. Eliza and other survivors' decision to testify was informed by their individual and collective sense of self-love, self-respect, and what Toni Morrison called self-regard. Targeted people's testimonies provide a counter-narrative to the stories we've been told about Reconstruction's supposed failure. Speaking with one voice, they said white Southerners were waging war on Reconstruction by attacking the people who were making the most of freedom. In naming their attackers, detailing their injuries, saying the names of their slain kin, crying out for justice, and doing what they could to keep the record of what happened to them alive, survivors said Black people's lives, freedoms, and futures mattered. Reporting and testifying about the war on freedom were survivors' best defense against its erasure. These testimonies did help to drive the federal investigation that eventually drove the Klan underground, but not before they seriously undercut freedom and Black people's participation in American democracy. After Confederates overthrew Reconstruction and boarded up the Temple of Liberty, they crafted what I call the big lie of the 19th century, that the experiment in American democracy had failed. They falsely claimed that white Northerners had unfairly punished white Southerners for secession by enacting, quote, Black rule. Black men did vote and they were elected into office, but they never enacted any policies that hurt white people or took away their rights. But none of that mattered to the Confederates and their supporters, who were determined to deprive Black people of any opportunity to transcend slavery. So they falsely claimed that emancipation, equal rights, and the franchise were wasted on Black people. These claims were part of a larger white supremacist political project to deny Black people dignity and equality after slavery. With Black people, quote, not knowing their place, white Southerners claimed they simply had no choice but to restore their honor. And the only way they could do that was by forming white terror gangs, overthrowing their oppressors, and installing the racist apartheid system of Jim Crow. They flooded the public discourse with so much of this propaganda in K-12 education, popular culture, politics, professional histories, and public policy that Americans ignored the stories that survivors like Eliza left on the historical record. And I saw death coming. I used testimonies like hers to challenge the failure narrative of Reconstruction by highlighting the story of African American families who leapt from the frying pan of slavery into the fires of freedom. What targeted people in the war after the Civil War knew and tried to communicate to anyone who would listen was that families were the cornerstone of Black people's individual and collective freedom. Family was the glue that bound them together. Voting, office holding, and equal rights were a means to a future in which Black families would be secure. That was why Confederates struck at the very heart of Black people's freedom when they overthrew the revolutionary experiment in multiracial democracy. For many survivors, the task ahead of them after testifying before Congress was to remember the future, to hold tightly to their kin and their deferred dreams while striding toward an uncertain horizon. I think that understanding Black family stories of racing into freedom and the price white extremists made them pay in the war against it, Americans learned that the arc of our history doesn't always bend toward justice. The real story is essential to understanding why, more than a century and a half later, our struggle continues today. Thank you.
All right, so now we have time for some questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come and bring the mic to you.
Thank you. Oh. Good to see you, Dr. Williams.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, of course. My question is based on some of the wording you used, the shocking impunity, because until 1876, there's still federal regular troops present. What are they doing? Are they complicit, or are they just ignoring it because they're also, white Northerners and Southerners and have the same white supremacist belief system?
So that's a great question. So I think there's a little bit of that, but I think what we have been told that there are troops in the South, that there are federal troops in the South, and there are, but historians who've tracked occupation have sort of shined like a bright light on the reality that the troop levels were shrinking, on a regular basis after the war. And so there are various points so that by 1876, for example, there are troops, and U.S. Grant will send some troops to certain areas. But when you look closely to see where they're stationed and how many there are, what you find out is that they're not a lot, right? In the state of Mississippi, at various points in time, you might have 300 federal troops, right? And they're in Jackson. They're not necessarily in the parts where the violence is occurring. People who are conducting these nighttime raids are strategic in where they strike. They're generally not striking where there are federal troops, or they're not striking in areas where there are Black communities where there's a Black majority and they are actively armed to defend themselves. So they're very strategic, and they're not attacking in areas for a long time. So by the time they send troops from Jackson into another community like Macon, the violence may have died down, but that's not before a great number of people have been killed or driven off their land. So there are troops in the region. They're just often not necessarily in places where the violence is occurring, except in places where President Grant boosts troop levels. But again, that's often, for many people, it's never enough to stop the violence completely. It may sort of tamp it down, and don't get me wrong, there are people who are like, thank goodness for the troops, they came so I can stay home, but it's never enough. And it's very hard to justify a standing army in a time of peace, because Confederates are saying, I thought we were at peace, why do we have a standing army here? And so there's a lot of political pressure to reduce the troop levels in the South, so that by 1876, 1877, there are still troops, but they're not a lot of troops. They're not as many troops as there had been in 1864. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. And I heard you speak on the radio, and that's why I had to come over and hear you speak, and I got this book. I'm wondering, have you written at all about the subsequent what they call the Great Migration to the North. Have you written about that also?
So I haven't.
Yeah.
But a lot of historians have. I know a lot of people like Isabel Wilkerson's On the Warmth of Other Suns. I like it too. But she already wrote that book.
Yeah.
I was writing on an earlier period.
Well, I'm eager to read this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming and for your question.
Thank you, and I look forward to reading your book. I wonder if you can address whether there was a big disparity between the Deep South and the Upper South in terms of this kind of behavior.
Right. In terms of the violence, like it's occurring over the sort of larger history of emancipation and Reconstruction. And so I think it's an important question, but I think what we have to acknowledge is that Confederates and even those people who were in the border states who didn't secede released Black people from bondage reluctantly. They're not enthusiastic about it. And so this violence is part of a larger freedom-denying enterprise. And so it's happening everywhere. It's in Tennessee, it's in Kentucky, which didn't secede, it's in Texas. You see this sort of everyday violence that's deliberately targeting Black people in taking their lives. You don't always see Klan violence everywhere, but you've got white men who are organizing, coordinating in these attack squads, even if the Klan isn't sort of officially in the region. So the violence is systemic. It's happening virtually everywhere, but there are places where it's worse. And that tends to be, like, it depends on where you are. If you're in sort of like the upcountry of South Carolina, there's a lot of violence there, but it's not necessarily down in, like Columbia or Charleston. It's not to say that there's no violence in Charleston, but there's more violence in a place like Spartanburg or York County, et cetera. So the violence is, there's all kinds of violence everywhere. The night raids are happening in very specific areas. And the problem with them is that you can never really predict or anticipate when they're going to pop up and how long they're going to be there. So it's happening across the region because it is that war on freedom. You know, one of the other things that we see with that is that while Black people were held in bondage, there's an incentive to keep them alive, right? But now that they're free, the value of Black people's lives in the minds of the people who held them in bondage declines significantly. So you are free to kill them. You're free to kill them a lot, and that's what happens. There is a general who says there are too many to count in Texas. We have no idea even where to begin to identify how many people have been killed.
Thank you very much. I truly enjoyed your reading, and I too heard you on the radio, and I'm from Detroit, so we made the trek up specifically for that, and Wayne State grad, so, okay. So anyway, I say that, my thing is I'd like to try to find ways to connect historical issues with what's happening with us today. Right. And so currently I'm doing a lot of work within the child welfare system and looking at the disparities and disproportionalities that we see Black families that are taken away. And I picked up on your saying that how important family is to the Black community and in history. Yes. And so what a violation it is for us today when we see that. So are there examples in which you see this play out of family being so important to the Black families in the South, you know, children and having their children, this connection to how horrible it is to be separated from your children, and this deliberate action that is taken to ensure the separation. So do you have examples of that, how that played out in history? Right.
I think it's very clear, we can get a sense of how much family meant to African Americans coming out of slavery by how the lengths they went to recover people who had been sold away from them. People walk for miles and miles. They save money. They board trains. They get on boats going to find their people, right? And only a few of them are actually able to reconnect with people who had been lost. People had passed on. They had not accurate information about where they were. So we do have those stories where there's a great story of a girl who, at the beginning of the war, her mother is sold to Texas. And she gains her freedom like in the next year, and she shoots out of Missouri. And she goes from camp to camp to camp to camp to camp to camp to camp, looking for her mother. And she does find her in Texas. But it's a long time, and that's one of the more beautiful stories. But they go to great lengths to recover their people. And they bring them together, they reconstitute their families as best as they can in light of the horrors of slavery. And they decide that they're going to fight for their futures. They say slavery is something we've endured, we survived, we are moving forward because we want to build a future for our children. And so they do this, and then they're targeted by the Klan, right? And so those families do try to pull together and stay connected, but going through what a lot of them went through is very hard. Right? You know, people, individuals and collectives, they can only go through so much trauma. And so it is a struggle for people to sort of reconnect and rebuild their lives after what happens. And so they can have like all of the love for each other in the world, but to survive a Klan raid, it becomes very difficult for people to sort of continue living in the world and living in the way that they had before they were attacked. So I think what we can learn from survivors, at least of this violence, is how shattering it can be to families. And that's what I think survivors who testified at the Klan hearings were trying to communicate, but the nation didn't want to hear it. And so I think that's part of a larger issue that I think we have to sort of deal with, to reckon with the challenges that families go through, especially in a white supremacist system.
And I think we see that continue today, because when children when they age out of child welfare,
Right.
and what they're doing is trying to find their families, they're traveling all over, and they're still suffering from the same trauma from the taking them away and living in this multi-layered system that is so complex and hasn't been healing for them, and they never were given a chance to heal. So that's, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. Thank you for
Yeah.
expanding on that.
Yeah. And I can provide historical context. I know what happened then. A sociologist would be able to sort of like grapple with, these issues for the present day better than I could. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. But we should have learned, right? What the harms that happen, the harms that occur. Yes.
I want to ask about the Klan's movement to the north. As you answered me earlier, you said that you didn't write about, the Great Migration, but I know that the Klan was active in these regions, and there was a rally, I believe, in Jackson, Michigan, and I don't remember what the numbers. I know it was 100,000. The figure 3 sticks in my mind. And my mother, who was born in '29, and they lived in Indiana, and she told me, what's a big family? I was the one who had conversations with her. And she said that she thought her father was a member of the Klan, that when she was 4 years old, he took her to 2 lynchings. And we lived up here. I mean, I wasn't born at that time. So, but the Klan must have came up, or whatever, they grew up here along with the Great Migration. As far as, I don't know, I'm not a historian, but I'm
Right.
thinking somehow they had
Right.
to be connected.
Well, I think the connection is, I think the issue is that a lot of people are familiar with the lost cause narrative, the sort of narrative that Confederates created, after the Civil War to justify defeat. Slavery had nothing to do with the war. It was only states' rights, et cetera. So we're familiar with that narrative, but I think we're less familiar with the northern/Midwestern narrative, which is that we're all abolitionists, right? White Northerners, white Midwesterners have crafted this sort of narrative that everybody was an abolitionist. And if all white Northerners and Westerners had truly been abolitionists, they could have abolished slavery before the Civil War. There were more white Northerners and Westerners than there were white Southerners in the country. And so if that's what they were, if that's who they were and what they truly wanted, they could have abolished slavery. That's not who they were. They only agreed to emancipation, the vast majority of them. And we know it's not to say that there aren't abolitionists in the North and West, because there are, but they're a sort of like a rump faction, you know? Nationwide, their numbers are quite small in comparison to the 20 million or so white people in the country, in the sort of North and West. So the numbers are quite small. If the larger white majority had wanted to abolish slavery, they could have, but here's the thing. They only accept emancipation begrudgingly in order to end the war. The vast majority of the white population in the North and West, right? There are some abolitionists, there are some soldiers who are tired of fighting and say, yes, let's abolish slavery because we can, end the war quickly. And I think we need to be clear on that they reluctantly accept emancipation. There's an editorial in the Cincinnati Enquirer that is published after I believe it's after the 13th Amendment, and it says, slavery is dead, the Negro is not. That is the misfortune. So we get a sense of how some white Northerners are thinking about this moment and thinking about emancipation. And I think that gives us context for understanding why they allowed the white South to do what they did. Because if anyone was in a position to stop the violence, to pressure elected officials, to take action, to pressure members of Congress, to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, it was white Northerners and Westerners. There were more of them. They had more power. Members of Congress, elected officials were more likely to listen to them. But they wanted to focus on other things. And they also shared some of the same white supremacist views as people in the South. So the existence of Klan sentiment in the Midwest does not surprise me, because I knew it was already here. They don't migrate to the region, although you do have white Southerners. There is a white Southern migration, of white Southerners out of the region. And they go west, they go to the Midwest, they go to all of these other places too. They're not necessarily bringing anything new to the region. The racism is already here.
Yeah, let me just mention quickly, my grandfather were never in the South. They were always Northerners, and they were white supremacists.
Yeah.
They told me, the African Americans, they live over there and they stay over there, and that's how it should be. And so, I got that in 1964.
Yeah.
From my right at home.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciate it. You use the term Confederates even after the Civil War, as opposed to Southern Democrats. Can you talk about that? Did the white Southerner still consider themselves Confederate?
Yes. So I call them Confederates because they accepted, they sort of begrudgingly accept defeat on the battlefield, but they haven't surrendered the cause, right? They haven't abandoned that cause. And their attacks on Black people are an example of how they're trying to keep the cause alive. And so that's why I do call them Confederates, but I do acknowledge that they are white Southern conservatives. White Southern conservatives at the time are in the Democratic Party. But in the story that I tell, I also talk about the fact that you've got that sort of significant contingent of white Northerners and Westerners who are also Democrats. The Democratic Party was a national party. Conservatives were as across the country then as they are now. They just happened to be in the Democratic Party at the time. And so you do have those white Southern conservatives who are participating in the violence, condoning the violence, but you have a lot of white Northerners and Westerners who are conservatives, white Northern Western conservatives, who are excusing the violence and who are refusing to listen to any evidence about it. And so those aren't just ordinary citizens, those are also people in like Johnson's administration. There's nothing you can tell certain members of Congress and certain members of President Johnson's cabinet, even when it's coming from the US Army officials. This is what's happening in the region. They just turn their heads and say, this isn't happening, they gotta be making it up, you're exaggerating. think there was one more. At least one more, two more.
Maybe there'll be others as well. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the sources that you discovered, where you found these voices and what it was like when you discovered them.
It's a great question. So the testimonies, the testimonies are really familiar to a lot of historians of Reconstruction. The thing is that they use these testimonies at the Klan hearings, I think, to establish the facts of election violence, right? So we know that election violence occurred. When I started reading the testimonies, that's what I was looking for initially. But then I slowed down and I started paying closer attention, right? Much closer attention to what these survivors were trying to communicate. Because the historical records that are available, you have the question they're being asked and then their answer. And you see all the ways that certain members of Congress are trying to denigrate them, to dismiss them, to trivialize what they said happened to them. And so what I saw in those moments was survivors fighting back to retain control over their story, to say, you're not going to minimize what I said. I know what happened to my family. One man, there was a lawmaker, an examiner who said, so what you're saying is that they didn't hurt you, right? And what he said was, what they did is hurting my family. And so what's interesting is that survivors, they rarely use the past tense. They never use the language of healing, of closure. They are broken wide open, even when they testify. And they're very clear on that. But they believe that for them to get justice, to stop other people from being targeted, that they need to step forward and tell their stories. And so those were some of the records I looked at, the congressional testimonies. I also looked at records, the affidavits that exist in the Freedmen's Bureau records. There's a record set called the Murders, Riots, and Outrages. It's so significant that there's a whole section of the records that are devoted to discussing this violence. And so there are a lot of affidavits in there where people relay their stories about what happened to them as they're trying to get justice. So you have that. I searched for families in the census, trying to track them over time. And the reason I looked at the census is because a number of survivors mention having been recently assessed, because they're saying, you couldn't possibly have all of this land. You couldn't possibly have this money saved. And so what they're saying is, well, the tax collector just assessed me, or the census enumerator was just here. So they can verify, right, what I've just said. So I started to look for families. And for some of them, I'm able to see their family before they were attacked, what it looked like, where they lived, who was in their household, how much money they had, how much land they had, and then after. And a lot of people, they leave their communities because it's no longer safe. So people are leaving rural Georgia and they're heading to Atlanta, or they're heading to Decatur. And I'm able to find some of the families in those communities, And most of them, those who were landowners, they never regained what they lost. But that's what they wanted. And so it was like a matter of finding those records and trusting survivors, not presuming that I knew more about the hurt that they endured than they did. And that can be like a sort of difficult thing, because they're not using the same language that we would use or associate with trauma, but they are very clearly disturbed by what happened to them, and they're theorizing on their future. There's this refrain throughout the testimonies, I don't think I'll ever get over it. She will never get over it. We will never be over it. One man said, they broke something inside of me, right? So even without the language of trauma that we are familiar with today, they are very clear in understanding for themselves and trying to communicate to others how devastating this violence was. So did I answer your question? Okay, thank you.
So as a follow-up to that, which I loved your answer, but as a follow-up to that, I think there's also about your personal experience. And I mean, obviously a Black woman, I assume you identify then as a Black woman. And so, reading on this, researching this, coming across these stories, that it sits in your soul, And so what were those things that you had to do in order to recover,
Right.
to heal from the trauma that clearly, you would have to experience as well, the vicarious trauma there?
Yes. That's a great question. Thank you for asking it. What I try to do is, I think, to do justice to survivor stories, to serve as an authentic witness, to not appropriate any of their stories, to not cloud my own experiences or my own thoughts and feelings on it. I sort of devote time to focus solely on the text and what I think they're trying to communicate and why and how, et cetera. And then I take I take a moment after I've sort of done that work because I don't want to dishonor them by missing something or by collapsing my own thoughts with theirs. But after I've sort of set their work aside, my duty to them aside, I come back and I sort of reckon with the horror. And what I'm also clear on is that this isn't something that I'm experiencing. And I'm very clear on that. This is their story of their trauma. And I'm trying to do them justice by making sure people understand what people refuse to hear at that time. And so I take time for them, I take time for me. But I'm very clear on this is not my trauma, this is theirs.
So I've been thinking about how to formulate this question, but in today's political climate and with everything that's going on and the attempts to change history to suit certain people, will your book be targeted? And how do we preserve this history? And how, if they're trying to extract it from the school systems and college systems, how do we pass this information down to our children? Because I heard you on the radio as well. And what struck me was that we had businesses, we had an economy, and if our children don't receive that reflected in us, and the only story that is told to them is that you were a slave, and now you're doing really bad, as opposed to that's not really our story. And what I heard from you on the radio is that that's not our story, but if they don't allow you to tell the story, how do we get that information to our children?
Right. That's a great question. So a two-part answer. One, I would be surprised if my work isn't targeted. That is kind of out of my control. I hope that it's not, but I'm realistic. I study the war on Reconstruction, so, right? But that other question in terms of what to do about efforts to erase this history is a little bit more complicated. I think that there are a couple of things. One, those of us who believe in liberty, freedom, and justice, we've got to fight for an accurate education, accurate histories to be taught. But the other thing is that so we need to fight for the accurate education in the public school system. And I think we have to be clear on why they targeted the history that they did. And I think it's because they know their children, right? And they know their children might play a role in building a better world, a more just world. And they are very clear on not wanting that to happen. So we need to be clear on what they're doing and why they're afraid. And we need to fight. But the other thing I think we need to do in terms of that fight is to realize that education, Black history education, has never only taken place in a public school. Most Black people, when I think about my subjects and, their children and grandchildren, their first educators, their first history lessons came from their families. So they were passing down these stories of who they were and what they made during Reconstruction in their families so that future generations were doing that. What we also know is that even during slavery, a number of states passed laws prohibiting, the teaching of Black people how to read and write, but a lot of Black people learned how to read and write because there are a lot of people who understood education as resistance, and they taught Black people, enslaved people, how to read and write. And even after slavery, even as, white Southerners are defunding Black schools, Black communities pull together. They have history pageants, they have history lessons. They're doing the work on a regular basis, even though they can't necessarily do it in the school. So I don't think that home/community education is a substitute for what should be happening in K through 12. I think it's a both and issue. We've got to do both if we believe that this history is important. I believe it's important, but I also grew up in a history-loving household. My parents loved history. They were my first historians. My mom was our family historian. She did that work and inspired me. So I think part of what we have to do is inspire our young people by helping them understand the history, right? And not just sort of like African-American youth, but all people, like, understand our history. Even, looking at this moment, this was a moment where the United States, during Reconstruction, especially during radical Reconstruction, attempted something that no other place that held African people and African descendant peoples in bondage in the West attempted. No one else tried what the US did in terms of the 14th and 15th Amendment, bestowing on or conferring all of these rights. The United States does. And so that tells us something about the nation, about a spirit in the nation that believes in liberty, freedom, and justice. It wasn't sustained, so they didn't follow through. They didn't do everything they needed to do in order to sustain the revolutionary reforms of that moment. But that doesn't mean that we can't. That doesn't mean, subsequent generations continue to fight. The people who come out of slavery, they fight, they seize freedom. They lay the foundation for the rights many of us today enjoy, even if we don't recognize it. And their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren played a significant role in the second Reconstruction in terms of what we now call the civil rights movement. They do the work. And we've had those moments of revolutionary reform and transformative change. So we can still do that work now. I think we have a long road ahead of us. I think we have to sort of move out of denial on where we are in this moment. And we have to sort of unite and establish coalitions to fight for a good history education and the fight for the building of a better world.
And I think we've got time for one more question. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
I can't ask a question that will ruin
Okay.
that wonderful moment you ended on, so I don't want him to do an office hour, so.
It's one of my students.
Okay, well, join me in thanking Professor Williams for
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for your great questions. Thank you for the team that set up